ultimate requirements that God intends. I don't think that describes the entire church. I think it describes a segment, a remnant, a smaller part. But the action remains incisively with them, however few. In fact, as I hope to suggest tonight, it has not even to do with what they will do as sons, but what happens by virtue of their becoming sons. Just the attaining of that condition sets something in motion of a remarkable kind, which contradicts our conventional wisdom because we're so action-oriented. As, for example, creation travailing and groaning until now, waiting for the manifestation of the sons of God. Not that they're going to be liberated by a program of ecology that sons will institute, but something happens simply by virtue of becoming. It's a whole other mode of reckoning and considering, and it needs to become ours. If you don't know it, sonship as a Hebraic and biblical term, and Paul is the only one who employs it, has to do with adoption. And it's the irony of a natural father adopting his own son. That is to say, the son is not called the son in the spiritual and significant way that God implies in the word until a certain condition of maturity is obtained and the father adopts what was his already by virtue of procreation. That does not mean that every child that the father has birthed automatically becomes a son. He may be an everlasting child, like many of us as Christians. It's a recognition, an acknowledgement that issues in a proclamation or a declaration. This day have I begotten you. This is my son in whom I am well pleased. It's an attainment that is not automatic and that only few obtain because the great majority don't even aspire toward it. But I'm hoping that as a result of tonight, that will be your aspiration and the purpose for your being. Because the last days purposes of God will eminently be fulfilled only by sons of God. Can you follow that? And when I say sons, I'm not in any way neglecting the daughters. Daughtership is implied in sonship. It's the coming to maturity which the Father recognizes and declares to the principalities and the powers of the air that this day something has been established that the Father recognizes. And that something is remarkable. Jesus himself did not come to it automatically. In fact, the first proclamation, "This is my Son in whom I am well pleased," had not to do with his birth, but with his baptism. And if I don't make an explanation of that, don't let me go until I do. What took place in his baptism was already an implicit statement of what would take place at the conclusion of his life at the cross. The going into death in baptism, the dying to every possibility that he might have enjoyed as a son of man, remarkably endowed and in all of the attributes of his humanity, was brought into death in the waters of baptism. And when he came up out of that death, the Father, recognizing that the Son had died even to the possibilities of what might have been his by virtue of his own humanity, said, "This is my Son, in whom I'm well pleased." He's only well pleased in sons, and he's bringing many sons to glory. Only sons can touch the glory of God. And is there a soul in the room who knows immediately and instinctively why this necessarily must be so? Only sons can be trusted with the things that pertain to his glory. Because his glory is the issue of his power, the issue of his authority, and it's not to be given to children. but to sons who are selfless with regard to themselves, and whose whole purpose for being is the fulfillment of the Father's will, the Father's purpose, the Father's glory. That is a definition of son. So I'll raise the question now, I'll come back to it later. Has this day come for you? This day have I begotten you. Rings out of Psalm 2, and again in Hebrews, I think chapter 1, maybe I'll read it. Making it clear that it's neither automatic nor implicit in birth. But when a certain condition is met that the Father recognizes, He declares the decree. And I'll tell you that all creation and everything that is at enmity with God takes note. The powers of darkness are terrified by sons. It's a process of adoption. It's not automatic. And I think I can safely say the great majority of Christians will never attain to it. Neither will they be trusted with the things that redound to the glory of God. It's something like those priests who minister in the outer court as against the sons of Zadok who ministered to God in the holiest place of all. It sounds very elitist, and there's something in our democratic constitutions that recoils against it. Equal rights for all. We're all going to be sons or no one, and that's the way it is. Sorry about that. There's a first fruits company, and there's a general harvest. There are people who attain to the first resurrection, and a great many who don't, and sleep while those who have attained to the first resurrection have part in the establishment of God's millennial kingdom and glory, because they have come to a place that is blessed and holy, and they have been made priests and kings unto God. The issue of sonship is the issue of priesthood. It's the issue of kingship. It's the issue of authority that can only be performed by sons who are also priestly by virtue of being sons. So having said all that, I'll sit down and let you scratch your heads. Lord, precious God, mystery of mysteries, but precious and ignored or passed over or made to look as if it's some kind of idle metaphor, a figure of speech. And I'm asking tonight, my God, that in this very room you will call sons and daughters to glory. And they'll be willing for that process of radical separation, even from themselves, even from their humanity, even from the things that are legitimate, that they might come to a place that you yourself recognize, that you can say, this day have I begotten you. This is my son. And give us, my God, the heathen for our inheritance, even the ones that are round about, let alone in the nations. Lord, fill this out and bring us through to a statement that will leave us long pondering and considering, and put us on a course by which this precious distinction may be obtained, for which even dumb and inanimate nature waits and groans and travails for the manifestation of the sons of God. Whatever that means, Lord, and to whatever degree you're pleased to reveal and to make it clear, do it, we pray. We'll thank you and give you the praise in Jesus' name. And God's people said, amen. So you know that I'm not just choosing something because it sounds esoteric, or I'm looking for some novel subject that others have not spoken. It's just something current that the Lord is quickening for me. And I sought Him so well as I could in the little time that I had. And He seems to be saying, this is my intention for tonight. Well, in Romans chapter 8, some familiar verses that need to become virginal again for our hearing. As, for example, verse 14, for as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. And then further down, verse 17, 18, and 19. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ, if so be that we suffer with him, that we might also be glorified together. For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of the creature, or the creation, waits for the manifestation of the sons of God. And then, verse 29, for whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. In Hebrews chapter 1, speaking about Jesus, who in these last days, the God who had spoken to us previously through the prophets and in diverse manners and ways, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things. Sonship and inheritance are implicit and connected. And then talks about the superiority of Jesus, who bears the very express image of God. In verse 4, being made so much better than the angels, as he hath by inheritance obtained a more excellent name than they. For unto which of the angels said he at any time, Thou art my Son, this day have I begotten thee. And again, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. Evidently, God regards the title Son as being more distinctive and more honorable than even that which is angelic, something supreme. And in verse 8, but unto the Son he saith, Thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of righteousness is the scepter of thy kingdom. Thou hast loved righteousness and hated iniquity. Therefore God, even thy God, hath anointed thee with the oil of gladness above thy fellows. So we can learn a few things about a son, namely, a jealousy for righteousness that is uncommon, and a hatred for iniquity, for which reason God anoints him above his fellows, and that righteousness is even the scepter of God's kingdom, and that a throne is established for a son who has this characteristic so identical to that of the Father. And then in verse 10 of chapter 2, for it became him from whom are all things, and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons unto glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings. So if it was not automatic for Jesus, and sonship is something to be obtained, requires a discipline that brings to maturity through suffering, then evidently the many sons who are being brought unto glory must necessarily come that way. And that's why most will shrink it. They'll be satisfied with being something lesser or other than sons. They'll not be jealous for the authority that is given to sons only, or the priestly ability to minister in the power of God and to invoke blessing by their prayer. In fact, the word blessing for many of us has become a shop-worn cliche. It's lost its cogency and its power. And we say, bless you, we fill the air with it, but no one in fact is blessed. Because only a priest can invoke the word blessing with an authority that confers something palpable, felt, and experienced. And you're no more a priest than you are a son. And that's revealed in chapter 7 of the book of Hebrews, the kind of priesthood that Jesus himself obtained, and the only kind that is available for us on the same basis. It has not to do with being a descendant of Aaron or a genealogy from the tribe of Levite, for that was not Jesus' earthly descent, but a whole other basis, a priestly order that supplants, replaces, and abides forever, that is called the Melchizedek priesthood, from that mystery name of that king priest who provided for Abraham bread and wine, and to whom Abraham gave tithes. The one instance in Genesis indicating that Abraham recognized the superiority, the spiritual superiority of this Melchizedek, in that he tithed to him and received blessing from him, for the lesser receives blessings from the greater. And this word Melchizedek comes up again in Hebrews in chapter 7, verse 1. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being by interpretation king of righteousness. Notice how frequently that word comes up. Do you love righteousness? You don't love it, my favorite saying for everything, unless you palpitate over it. Unless the word actually makes the juices flow under your tongue. Unless you know that you can't define it, and yet you're remarkably and insanely jealous over it. Whatever righteousness is, you love it. And in fact, your soul is chafed by anything that is not righteous, however acceptable to the world and even to the church. Others don't even notice and don't mind, but you see it, you hear it, an inflection, and something in your righteous soul is chafed. So one thing I think I can say with absolute authority, righteousness is implicit in sonship. But like avocados, you need to cultivate a taste for it. And the world will not help you to that. In fact, everything in the world is inimical, opposed to righteousness. This is an age of sleaze. And so to love righteousness in such an age as this requires the intensity of a son. And God will know when it has sufficiently found place in our hearts that he might say, this day I have begotten you. King of righteousness and also King of Salem, which is King of peace. And here comes the vivid and remarkable credentials of what constitutes a Melchizedek priest. Because it's clear that there's no one in this room that can qualify for any other priesthood of the Aaronic or Levitical kind, seeing that that priesthood is dispersed and extinct, and seeing that you're not Jewish. And the fact that I am an actually descendant from that lineage is not the basis by which I am speaking and ministering to you tonight, but rather on the basis of this Melchizedek priesthood, which is available to any believer if, like Jesus, we have followed these qualifications without father, without mother, without descent. Isn't that a contradiction? The Aaronic priesthood was predicated upon descent. The Melchizedek, which is an enduring and eternal priesthood, is without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abides a priest continually. We can't rush that one. Why do you think that these are the intrinsic qualifications of priesthood, and what has being a son to do with it? These are the kinds of questions that you ought to be asking as you engage yourself with the Word of God. Do you do that? Do you wrestle with the Word and draw out its meaning and put questions to it? And why does God say it that way? And what does he mean by that? And what's the connection between this and this? Aren't you doing that? Don't you draw arrows between one word in this verse and then across the page to another word in that verse, and you show a linkage and underline and put your asterisks and things? Don't you do that? Don't you draw the marrow out of the bone? Or are you still on milk? Let alone meat, let alone marrow. Well, let's conduct a little intensive Bible study and ask these questions. What does it mean? Now, let's start afresh. This is critical, saints. The world is dying for the want of those who have priestly authority, who can turn away judgment, who can confer blessing, who can minister in the authority of God, who are sent ones from the throne of God. Because they're before the throne of God, they're in priestly intercession. They take upon themselves burdens that others are not willing to bear. And when they speak, their words are not just instructive, nor even inspirational. They constitute event. There's a world dying for the want of that kind of priesthood on the earth. And remember what Israel's calling was? A nation of priests and a light unto the world. The world is so subnormal tonight. Even the church is subnormal because we have not even the expectation, let alone the sense of the possibility that there should be such a class of beings on the earth who can bless in the authority of God. I can tell you straight out that unless in a soon coming hour there is such a company of men and women on the earth who are of this priestly qualification, Israel is finished and has no possibility whatever of being raised up out of its graves to which God is bringing it, that it might be restored as the head of all nations and be the locus of God's theocratic kingdom in the earth. If Israel is not restored through priestly intercession and ministry, the Lord himself remains contained in heaven, in the heavens, yet waiting for the restoration of all things spoken by the prophets that can only be obtained by sons. Remember what it says in Hebrews 3? Speaking to us who have this heavenly calling, that we are to consider Jesus the apostle and the high priest of our confession. If it was incumbent for him to be priest as well as apostle, what is it incumbent for us? I want to say again, in a declarative authority, there's no way that we can be apostolic, nor prophetic, nor any other distinction in God if we are not first priests. You cannot be a prophet without being a priest. You can't be apostolic without being priestly. There is an intrinsic conjunction between these two distinctives. It was necessary for Jesus. It's necessary for us. Now I'll bet you that you've never considered these things. And you think that priesthood is an Old Testament category that is quaint to occasionally look at, but it's not a New Testament requirement. You could not be more wrong. In fact, maybe we can even say that the church is in its particular and pathetic condition today for the want of this consciousness of the centrality of priesthood as being intrinsically co-joined with being both priest and son. It's all together, and it needs to come together for us. Okay. And yet, we cannot obtain to it if we are still linked to father and mother and to genealogy. What do you think of them apples? You who boast of your Jewish ancestry, or Irish, or any other kind of distinction that is earthly, and however much we like that honoring on that basis, if you continue to cultivate it, you make yourself void of priestly consideration. We have a little controversy in my backyard in Minnesota because we're 8 miles from the headquarters of the Chippewa Nation, and this is an hour of heightened ethnic and racial consciousness. Black power, Indian power, red power, yellow power. Everyone wants to come into the identity of their ethnicity that needs now to be respected in a new way. Fine for them, but it disqualifies them for heavenly things. And as an Indian brother was saying to me, who has become quite assimilated into white culture, he said, I was saved, I was adopted by a white family, I was raised as a Christian, and only now in my 50s am I beginning to be aware of my ethnic identity. And my people are suspicious about a Christianity that acculturates them and compels them to lose their Indian distinctive, because when I was a kid, we were told to forget our Chippewa language, and our customs and practices and become assimilated into white man's culture. Well, what a pity that that culture was also Christian, and that in their understanding, that which is white is also Christian. But the fact of the matter is, that's how much our Christianity is substandard and unpriestly and lacks its heavenly quotient. It is earthly. It is middle class. It is white. It does show forth a certain kind of culture. So what's your answer, Kid Katz, to the predicament of Indians who don't want to embrace the gospel for fear of forsaking their identity? Are you going to call them to becoming Christians so they can be white? By the way, it's the same fear that Jews have. And my answer is, we're not calling them to an alternative earthly civilization or culture that's white or middle class. We're calling them to a heavenly civilization that is above all earthly distinction, and that alone is salvation. Imagine if it prevailed in Yugoslavia today. We would be without the gore, the blood, and the rape that has victimized hundreds of thousands in this ethnic bitterness of men who celebrate their earthly distinction and want their identity established on that basis. How can you be above mother and father, especially being Jewish, and Jewish mothers? And don't they deserve some satisfaction? And don't you have to condescend to them? And don't they wring their fingers on how much they've suffered for their sons? And you know, I don't want to make a big case out of it, but it is a big case. You know what the irony is? Unless we have risen above considerations of that sentimental kind, we cannot bless our Jewish mothers. We might gratify their soulishness and placate their earthly hearts by making nice, but we cannot bless them in any priestly sense. If I'm going to bless my mother unto salvation to the uttermost, it's only as a priest who, if he was in the earth, he would not be a priest at all. Are you above father and mother? Isn't it interesting when God called Abraham, get thee out of nation, kindred, and father's house? The three most potent stakes that can be planted in any man's heart: nation, kindred, father. Get thee out. The radical, searing severance and rupture from every earthly thing that will inevitably corrupt you and force you to act in a way less than that of a son and of a priest. You're not going to attain to this without some dying. Would you think if I'm boasting if I say, or you would ask, Art, what kind of reception have you had in Egypt? Particularly in southern Egypt, in the villages that are absolutely primitive, where you came into little squat mud huts with dirt floors and Christians swathed in rags, as a Berkeley grad and a Jewish convert and speaking the King's English. I'm sure they must have reacted and been self-conscious about the very clear social, ethnic, and other distinctions that would have put them at arm's length with you. Or the East Germans before the wall came down, or other places where I've been in third world countries. You know what the converse is? Immediate acceptance, because they do not see me as coming to them as being American or representing that culture. There's something above and other. They may not be able to define it, but they are comfortable with it, and it opens them. And Paul had this distinction. And that's why when he called for the elders of the church at Ephesus, at the termination of his apostolic career, they came from Ephesus to Miletus, and they didn't fly there. They came on foot, or they came on the back of an ass. It was a wearisome and exhausting journey, because Paul called them, they came. No ifs, no ands, no buts, no questions needed to be asked. Paul called, they came. And he told them, "You'll see my face no more. But I have not withheld from you the whole counsel of God. Night and day in public places and from house to house, I proclaim the whole gospel of God. And after my departure, ravenous wolves will come, even out of your own ranks. But you'll see my face no more." And when they heard that, they wept. And when they kneeled down with him on the beach to pray, weeping and hanging on his neck, that they would see his face no more. And they were Gentiles. Evidently, they were not relating to the Pharisaical Jew who tore the church up in his zeal for God. They were dealing with a man whose citizenship was actually in heaven, who did not look upon the things that are temporal, but saw the things that were invisible and eternal, and the invisible weight of glory. He spoke to them above culture and above time, of the things that are eternal, enduring, and abiding. From what place do we speak? And with what authority do we come? And what salvation do we bring? We just need to sense the ache of God's heart, the cry for sons and daughters of God who are priestly, who can confer blessing, who can lift men up and out of the insecurity and the fear of identity crisis. And what am I? Am I an Indian? Am I this? Am I that? And invite them to a place with authority that transcends every earthly consideration, because that's the place where you yourself are and from which you come. We can't invite our hearers to something that we ourselves have not obtained. Without father or mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, above time, above culture, above place. He's in the eternal and the enduring condition, but made like unto the Son of God. I'm so happy for the word made. It's not automatic and it's not easy. It's a process of dying by which those earthly things are forsaken and given over. It hurts. It's painful. They're familiar. They're dear. They're sentimental. They have long traditions and histories. We have been nurtured in them. Our identity is established in them. To forsake them is nothing less than a dying. Which raises the whole question, when does God declare the decree, "This day have I begotten thee"? Is it the day that Jesus was born? Evidently not, because it says in Psalm 2, "and have given you the heathen for your inheritance." You don't give that to infants. The day in which Jesus was begotten was the day of his death and of his resurrection. We are the sons of resurrection, or we are not sons at all. Everything implies death and resurrection. You don't go from the earthly plane to the heavenly without that kind of power. And there's no resurrection without the tasting of death. It says in verse 16 of chapter 7, "who is made a priest, not after the law of carnal commandment, but after the power of an endless life." The life that is endless is the life that is indestructible. It is the resurrection life. That's why you abide a priest continually. You don't take it off. You're not minister one moment and then relax later when your duty is over and put your feet up on the coffee table and become another man. You don't have one voice when you're speaking professionally and another voice when you're one of the boys. You're one thing consistently and ever. A priest that abides continually in the power of the indestructible life. If you ever followed me around for a week, 10 days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 5, 2 months overseas, in 12 countries, and all of the exhaustion and the prostration of 5,000 miles in a old VW van and hours waiting at border crossings, and all of the exigencies and the unforeseen things and the difficulties, the resistance of the saints, even Jewish saints who look upon you suspiciously and have to be won over, and all of the weight of these things, you know this: the only basis by which such a life can be lived and such a service rendered is on the basis of the power of the indestructible life. The issue of sonship is the issue of resurrection. This day have I begotten thee is the day of the resurrection from the death of the Son. And it's the day in which we are begotten also. The question is, has this day come for us? And on what power then are we living our life? In what power are we serving? In what power are we ministering? If you don't know that it's possible to minister and to serve God on the basis of the natural life, then you're missing, I think, the basis by which perhaps 90 or 95% of Christianity is performed today. The reason that we've gotten away with it so long is because our contemporary Christianity does not require more. It's not that radical that we cannot perform it on the basis of our own energy, well-meaning intelligence, and intention. But launch out in God and pull out the stops and make yourself available where there's no day and night and the issues are greater than any ability that you have to serve. And you'll realize that except you're sustained by the life of God, there's no way at all that it can be obtained. I'm on a one-man campaign to restore the credibility of resurrection to the church, who only thought that they had to endorse it as a correct doctrine and had no obligation to know it as the basis for their life and being. Paul was a priest upon whose neck Gentile elders hung because he was a man from a heavenly place who had counted as dung any earthly dependency on Jewish ability, intelligence, or religious expertise. He was a son of the resurrection, and therefore a priest, and therefore an apostle. Do you believe that? Do you know how to obtain that? Are you willing for the mortification by which the lesson is learned? Are you willing to pull out the plug? Are you willing to take a shot at it tomorrow at work, at your profession, at the place where you have so long excelled on the basis of your ability, and shut it off and be dead and hid with Christ in God until His life be revealed? See what happens there. And don't think you'll not be tested. Don't think that the Lord will not reveal His life because you ache to somehow get through the crisis of the moment without loss of face or humiliation. He'll test you. But only a son will be willing for such a test. You know why? The issue for him is not getting by and avoiding humiliation. The issue for him is willing to experience the death of humiliation, if only thereby God might be glorified. Bringing many sons to glory. So long as you're suffused with the concern for yourself, and you're getting by, and you're being found acceptable as preacher, as secretary, as business executive, as professional, so long as that is your criteria and that is your concern, you forfeit any possibility of priestly distinction and blessing at all. The priest is a fool for Christ's sake. Oh, I wish I could have taken you into myself, sitting right there, waiting to be called on to speak, and you thought that Katz was going to come lurching out like a runner out of the blocks, ready to go to knock him dead, because he's always got one up his sleeve. You should know. You should know what was sitting in that seat. A lump, uninspired, tired, weary already. I haven't caught up on the last 2-3 trips, let alone this trip. I set my clock for 6 this morning, but I was up at 5. There's no night and day. I don't even note it anymore. And then you feel like a beggarly nothing, and you've been picked up and brought from one to another and fed, and you just want to crawl into a corner and not be called upon. But the hour comes when the issue is not preserving your reputation, which is fast going down the drain anyway, but ministering priestly blessing to God's people. I'll tell you how ambitious I am for tonight. I am not content that you should be blessed in any way in which we've used that word till now. I will only be content if the word that has come to you tonight constitutes an event that will never again let you go. A word has come, it has lodged into your spirit, it will haunt you. And whenever you're unrighteous in your thinking and your secret thoughts or your conduct or falling short of the resurrection when you know you could have opted for it, the Lord will remind you of the word that has come and call you up to this high standard. That's what I'm shooting for. And no man can have that for his intention and succeed on the basis of his own natural or religious ability. It can only be the result of a resurrection strength or not at all. Don't be fooled if the form that the life takes and the expression comes through a vessel that has a Brooklyn accent. That is not the source of the life, the thought, or its power. It only colors it in the quaint way that it pleases God. Are you following me? You know, we'd be way ahead if we just settled for this much tonight, just to fall before God and say, Lord, our faith is so pitifully low that though we accede to the truth of doctrine, of resurrection as doctrine, we cannot conceive that we ourselves can move and live and have our being in it. It's so beyond our reach and our estimation, and we're so unwilling to taste the death alone by which resurrection comes. We're moral and spiritual cowards who want to get by and have little scant jealousy for your glory. If we so much as confess that, we would be so much closer to what God is after. The Lord must be jealous over you guys. To keep hammering at you like this. He's after something that's ultimate. And I must say that with the growth of your priestly consciousness, words like end times and last days become converted. They are no longer little pieces of brittle scriptural understanding, but burning verities. You begin to really sense the imminent collapse of present civilization, of things going altogether out of control, of economies going berserk, of panic-stricken multitudes in communities of nations who don't know how to walk into walls without guidance and without direction, and beside themselves and ready to blow their brains out or someone else's if they can't get orange juice and Pampers, as was the case in the Los Angeles riot. Imagine if there could come to them in that condition of perplexity, priestly ministers who are calm in the midst of distress, who know altogether that these are last days convulsions that conclude the age apocalyptically, but introduce the millennial glory to come, and speak a word that could guide that person to the peace that is of God despite circumstances. This is on the basis of the indestructible life. And I can't find that verse that says that if he were of the earth, he would not be a priest. And I add the words, at all. Now consider, it says in verse 4 of chapter 7, how great this man was. Well, let's just look at two more things. I've parts of the earth for thy possession. It's granted only to sons. The unsaved, the unregenerate, round about, in this locality, in our own nation and other nations, is an inheritance that God grants to sons for whom he has declared the decree and set them in the place of kingly authority. Jesus is a pattern son. And the other verse, maybe we'll conclude with it in Romans chapter 4. What is the day? This day I have begotten thee. What day? Romans 4, I think, will show. Romans 1, I'm sorry. Verse 4. Well, just let me read from the beginning. Paul, Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of God, which he had promised before by his prophets to in the Holy Scriptures concerning his Son Jesus Christ our Lord, who was made of the seed of David according to the flesh, and declared to be the Son of God with power. Look how all of these things come together. According to the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection from the dead. The decree was declared in the day that Jesus was raised from the dead. The pronouncement has got to be the pronouncement that only follows the reality of resurrection when the life is no longer from the natural source, but the divine. I end with the question with which I began. Has this day come for you? When God, in recognition of your adoption as a son, seeing your maturity, seeing your selfless heart, that your whole purpose for being is the jealousy for the glory of God the Father, that you'll not speak your own words or do your own thing or seek your own pleasure, and that you'll not seek to fulfill the requirements of God on the basis of your own natural or religious ability. God will say, this day I have begotten thee. I will declare the decree, and the powers of darkness will hear it. God is waiting, for he's bringing many sons to glory. How about it? Are you willing to be made unto the form of a Son of God, who is without father, mother, beginning or ending of days, or genealogy or descent, but being made in the form of a Son of God, abides a priest continually? Those who are not candidates for sons tonight have heard this through ears that dismisses the whole thing as being distant, what's the word? Untenable, unattainable. There's another word, that unrealistic, picturesque, not anything that constitutes something that is authentic or obtainable. But those who are being called to sons will sense something in their hearts and be willing to give themselves to the process by which they are made sons. And will you think it arrogant if I say that I believe that only recently I feel that I've crossed over and have entered into this realm? It's taken 30 years, but I know that something's happening. My word is becoming more authoritative. My virtual every speaking is becoming event. The days that have preceded my coming here have been awesome. I came to my publisher, and I was showing the brother traveling with me the layout there, and we came to the publishing thing where the books are, and a young man with a scrabbly beard, oh, he said, Art, he said, I hated your book, Spirit of Truth. I threw it down, I kicked it across the room, and I had to go back and pick it up again. And I read it and I threw it down again. You got me so mad. He said, finally, he said, I broke through. And I'm so grateful. He was so full of candor. He just straight out. I love this guy. And his nickname was Ham. I said, you know, if ever the Lord calls you to Jewish ministry, that name will have to be changed. He said, well, why don't you give me a name? I said, well, I'll pray about it. You know, the way we say, I'll pray about it. Like the way we say, oh, bless you, brother. And I walked away and I put my hand on the door handle of the car to drive away, and the Lord said, Caleb, Kolev in Hebrew, wholehearted. I left the door and I came back and said, your name is Caleb, Kolev, wholehearted. I saw him the next night. He had shaved his little fictitious beard away. He said, the Lord said, he said, I went home that night. He said, the moment you spoke that word, it went into my spirit and it lodged there. That name was an event. You spoke something into my being, and the Lord said, now take off the false beard and do this and do that. He said, I'm another man the moment that that word came into me. That's what I'm talking about, saints. Word as event. When it comes in resurrection power, in the authority given to sons who will not touch God's glory, who are selfless with regard to themselves or their reputations or any such thing, and have one purpose only, the glory of God, and love His righteousness. He's calling many sons to glory. Will you be among them? It'll make all the difference in your eternity. Whether you get by in this life and have no eternal distinction, no reward, no crown. You're not going to go to hell, but you're going to occupy a place away from the presence of God and not have a place of priestly blessing and kingship to rule and reign with Him forever. That's what this is life about. That's what this life is about, to choose how far you're willing to go. It will not be a snap. To be made a son and to be without father and mother, without sentimentality, without nationality, without identification, without earthly connection, is death before it becomes heavenly detachment, authority, and power. Are you looking for the day when the voice of God can say, this day I've begotten you? Let's pray that whatever it takes, it's a free-willing, voluntary thing, the day will come for you because you choose to be made into the form of a son or a daughter of God. It's so much more than just being a child. Precious God, Holy One, this is more important tonight, Lord, than any of us know and can even suspect. It's not a message per se. It's not a sermonizing. It's a call, a divine call. And I pray, my God, that you might receive answer from men and women in this room who indeed had complimented themselves on their walk and their devotion, but were not in this place, did not have even the faith to desire such a place, and even now, hearing of the possibility of it, tremble. Lord, I'm asking that tonight will make a difference both in time and eternity. That because of tonight, because the word that has been sent, a choice will be made, a decision will be made that will eventuate in sons and daughters who will affect their generation powerfully to bless it in the authority of God and the power of His life. That when they say bless you, Something will be imparted. That when they speak, it's more than a suggestion. And are willing for whatever it takes to move them from where they presently are to that place in that day that you will beget them. You transact in your seat, saints, and tell the Lord how far you're willing to go. Thank you, Lord. Precious Holy One. Break, my God, every earthly dependency, every earthly condition, however legitimated by the world and even sanctioned by the church. Grant a love for righteousness and for heavenliness that makes us willing, my God, to bear the snap, crackle, and pop of every severance from that which would keep us on the earth where we cannot be priests at all. Grant us the faith to believe for this, that we will be among those sons whom the Lord has brought to glory. If you need to say something before the Lord now, here's a first step of sonship. Break through the barrier of intimidation, fear, and self-consciousness. And announce something to the Lord in the hearing of witnesses and the powers of the air about your intention in God. Is the first step to break earthly restraint. How serious are you? You speak from your seat. That step. Commence the process.